So today's the big 4th of July episode.
I'm so proud. As proud as I am of my country, I'm proud of Jacob for making a full out. Like that was the most thoughtful, just like complete, comprehensive outline I think I've ever seen. It put me to shame.
Talk about an American Revolution, folks.
As I was reading it, my thought was the world has turned upside down.
Very nice.
Uh-huh. Well, you wanted to ask me what my favorite 4th of July movie / show is. That was
that's it. Yeah.
So, I mean, how can I not like it? I almost thought this was just going to be an hour-long excuse for me to make Hamilton references.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Are you going to take your shot?
Oh, well, I feel like I'm going to just get too cheesy if I keep like yes-anding to that. So yeah, I'll just, yes. Yeah.
Welcome everybody. I think, am I like the lead on this one now?
You know what? This is
officially...
Yeah. You're
like the British and I'm like the American upstart that like
I guess
kicked you out, and now I'm the...
I was gonna make like a waltz reference, like the lead or whatever, but sure, you can make it a war reference. So
well, American Revolution, Independence Day reference. That's all I'm doing. Yeah.
So
okay.
Well, so anyway, that's my pick is Hamilton. I've probably seen the Disney like movie version of it. Many
that's
times.
What I've seen.
I haven't gone.
Oh wait, you didn't see it on Broadway?
I haven't.
Mike?
I haven't made the trip out to Broadway or to off Broadway or anything like that. So not
London.
Yet.
You didn't see it out there either.
I wonder how. It would
I wonder
play.
if that hurt. I wonder if
it,
that hurt British audiences to.
Yeah, if it stung a little. I think
we like the music so much, but the message hurts our heart.
I think, and because it's supposed to be kind of like a subversive take, I think you'll still eat it up, even if you aren't. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So,
honestly, I did not find it subversive. I as a huge fan of American history, as a huge fan of, this holiday and certainly the American Revolution as a historical subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
I loved Hamilton. Hamilton was great. The music was good.
Yeah.
That's the type of thing that you need to see more of. You need to see more, like ownership of like what I love about America, across all audiences, right?
And
because it's not deconstructive. I mean, like it plays in that camp because like clearly everyone's race swapped, right? Like it's played by a cast
and
of
it's somewhat rap music, and so it's
and it's using traditional like rap music type stuff, but that's the type of like acclamation, that's the type of like bringing together and melting pot type idea that should be happening all the time.
That was Miranda's intention too. So it was
because someone like me who loves everything about this history loves that movie too.
No,
it's not disrespectful to it at all.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, just like and sorry to get all like, so he talks about his first smash was In the Heights, and he says how that was like a love letter to his neighborhood that he grew up in. And this was in a similar vein. Not that it was necessarily like a love letter to America. It was sort of like loving America despite what he sees in many ways as the modern faults, but also as the faults that would have been current to that time too.
Well, we're all called to do that.
Yeah,
it's not like I'm happy about slavery.
No,
it's not like I'm pro slave ownership, right? And just like whenever you're called to love anybody. Mm-hmm. You're not loving them because they're perfect. Like you couldn't, if perfection was some kind of standard, or even like we're not even close to perfection. Even if any like whatever standard you want to put in place for.
And actually, that's kind of how Chesterton defined patriotism compared to nationalism. Is he said nationalism was loving the country because of the faults, and patriotism was loving the country in spite of the faults, like wanting to fix the faults.
Sure.
So. Yeah, no, it's the same kind of, and if anything, if nothing else, if you were, and I don't consider myself like a student of Broadway by any means, but every single song in Hamilton has references to like other past Broadway musicals. And so it's like some sort of like it's got like different homages all the way through, of just like whether it's the similar beat that this other popular, like I'm trying to think of, so the George Washington song has like a lot of hints of the Pirates of Penzance. I can't think of the year that's from, but then there's a lot of like Les Mis references or kind of like references throughout too. So,
I did not know that.
So there you go. Yeah, it's, if anything, even if you didn't like the whole, like, even if you're super patriotic and you don't like it, or you are not patriotic and you don't like it, even if you like Broadway, you can still like Hamilton. But alas, I'm not trying to hijack your episode, Jacob. This is not a Hamilton.
Is this
episode.
what it feels like? Is this what it feels like?
Yeah.
When I pour all this blood, sweat, and tears into my outline, and you just sit there and talk about Hamilton for 10 minutes.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, this is my this is my revenge or whatever. But
yeah, right.
So anyway, that's my favorite 4th of July movie / show is definitely Hamilton, far and away. Like ever since, and that came out in 2020 is when it came out on Disney Plus.
So you just lack imagination. You're just basic.
Oh, and what is
like, what's the most popular? What's the most popular?
What are you going to choose, Jacob?
Well, ironically, I was going to choose John Adams, the HBO miniseries, which is much older than 2020, though. So, boom, there you go. Now, from what I understand, you haven't seen this show.
No.
But anyone listening to this podcast needs to go find a way to check out John Adams this 4th of July season, or any time of year, frankly. It is a fantastic miniseries. And it's got Paul Giamatti playing the main character, John Adams, and whatnot. And it goes all the way through like his beginnings, just as like a lawyer in Boston, and all the way through his presidency, right? So it covers, and even up into his death, actually. So it covers post-presidency, his entire life, but so much of it is very much weighted around like the revolution at the front, right? The second half gets more into like his years as a diplomat and as the president and whatnot.
Sure.
But the best stuff, I like the entire show, but the best stuff happens in the first half, I would say. That's where you get John Adams, like, he's the only lawyer in Boston who's willing to defend the British soldiers who actualized the Boston massacre.
Okay.
Right? And so you have like this, and it's all real history too. That's why, like, so when we were talking about doing this episode, we were trying to figure out like, well, what should we do for 4th of July? What should we do for 4th of July? And you were wanting to do some bogus, like, oh, let's go talk about the boys or something like that. And it's like, okay, Mike, okay, buddy. Whereas I, the patriot that I am, was like, let's talk about America. Let's unironically talk about, America, the myth. Not in a fake way, in the way that we use it on this show. Like, what is the myth of America? And so that's where we're coming from. And so what John Adams as a show does is it goes through the history. And what's so great about the American story at its founding, like the first, basically everything from like the European settlers coming all the way up through the Civil War is just like high storytelling. Only what's great about it is it's real, like, and not in it's like we were there, like it's in recent memory, so that like none of it is kind of like lost to history or opaque or being reinterpreted through like generational storytelling. It's all just like there for us to like read the documents and whatnot. And so and yet it's still absolutely profoundly mythic at pretty much like every turn. So, the origins of America are one of my favorite subject matters to talk about. I mean, did we turn into the Whore of Babylon, in our decadent late empire stage?
There's a tear rolling down your cheek right now. There's a flag waving in the background. It's too bad we haven't gone to video yet, because there's a bald eagle perched on your shoulder as you say all this.
I know. My beard is turning more and more Abe Lincoln like as I speak. But Yeah, but our history is amazing. American history is amazing. I think that we're kind of like in kind of strange times, but you can talk about just the story of America, and it's endlessly fascinating. So that's what I'm excited to talk about today.
All this
And related
sincerity is
to
making my stomach hurt. Where's the and don't worry, there will be a boys episode. There will be an episode on the boys.
I'm sure. Yep, I'm sure there will be. So, when getting into American history, one of the things that's fun about it is how you can't like make this up, right? Like so much of it is just really, really good storytelling, like what I was saying. And so where to start here, I thought it might be fun to look at take like kind of a bird's eye view of it briefly, and then we'll like do a quick run through of like the actual history of it, so I can point out examples of what's so incredible about this.
And I love that you started off talking like connecting it to the hero's journey, because that's the thing is like, we usually use the hero's journey for fictional or mythical stories, but here it applies just as much to history. And we've already tried to do that with the Gospels. We've already tried to say saying how the hero's journey applies to the Gospels or to myths doesn't make it fake or not true. And so applying it to this historical example of the founding of America or just America in general, I think is important and significant.
Well, one of the things that I'm striving to do these days is view nations as people, ultimately, right? To get back into this idea that like nations themselves are a spiritual enterprise, a spiritual entity, even. And we've talked a little bit about this in times past, but you can go and you can look at nations as such and take all the techniques that you use when thinking about how human persons or even other spiritual creatures, right, act and behave, and it actually maps like super well. And so, one of the things that you can do with the story of America is just do these broad strokes on it and realize that you're talking about something that kind of resembles like a hero's journey, which is what makes the story so compelling.
That's a reason why we write the stories that we do, is because they it's art imitating nature. I mean, it's just now you're just talking about it on a wider political scale as opposed to maybe a personal scale, but it's the same thing.
Yeah. No, and like, so back in the day, you'd see like illustrations of like, people would personify their nations, right? And they would even they would even create these personas that represent them. In America, we have like Uncle Sam, right? Or maybe Lady Liberty, right?
There was that lady from the French Revolution painting, it's on the cover of the Coldplay album. I can't remember what it's called. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think. Well, and Britain had done this before, like Britannia, like what's her name? Prior to Uncle Sam and maybe even like Lady Liberty, and maybe Lady Liberty is a kind of like update to Columbiana. So Columbiana is the statue that's on top of like Capitol Hill, right? So if you go look at the Congressional building or the Congress building, the statue that is on top of that dome is, I'm pretty sure it's Columbiana. I guess like, whatever, correct me if I'm wrong, folks. But like, and that's just, it's the personification of the Americas, right? And so people would go and they would create these personas. And there's something deeply human about that. And there's actually something, like take it all the way back to like Athens. The city of Athens existed before Athena, the god, came about. Athena was the patron deity of Athens. And the stories of Athena, she comes out of the state of Athens, right? And takes on a life of her own, at least in the stories. I think that like you could argue even that there is a spirit that adopts the persona and actually like embodies it.
And wasn't it kind of fitting that she's the goddess of wisdom and Athens is where we have,
Well, that's why. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. It's the reason why Athena is the goddess of wisdom is because Athens was this city that was known for its wisdom. And so their patron goddess became the goddess of wisdom. It's not like a retcon.
There are no accidents. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, like, and I think Uncle Sam has become kind of like if you really want to approach this, like there's like multiple kind of spirits kind of finagling for like top dog of who's going to represent America kind of thing. I guess you can get like Uncle Sam, right? But anyway, this idea goes all the way back. My point being that America is in some sense a person that's constituted by all the individuals that constitute her, right? Or him, or whatever. And so what the basic story of this country is all the individuals that come out of religious persecutions, either up north, right? Or, for commercial enterprises down south. But they go out into the unknown. They go out into the new world, right? There's this discovery. They go out there. And when they're out there, they go through a lot of hardship, a lot of struggle. They have to ultimately face a big red dragon, right? The British Empire, which is the most powerful empire in history at the time. And they have to like kind of slay that dragon. And then the idea is that the virtue, the treasure that they've discovered in the process of going through that adventure is supposed to be a light to the entire world. Because all of this is very much
light to the nations is
their
very
intention.
much the, church / messianic image applied to Jesus too.
Yes, it's
get it from Isaiah. But then, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was about to say like, oh shoot, now I'm not going to remember the guy's name. The guy that was in charge of the Mayflower and like the Pilgrims and all that. Unless I'm just like mixing up my history here, but like basically there's a famous like city on a hill quote where he's taken that quote out of Matthew. And he says, we're going to be a city on a hill. We're not going to hide our light under a bushel. We're going to be an example to the nations, right? I mean, that's baked into the DNA of what people were doing when they came to this country, at least in part of it. We'll get into that a little bit.
Wasn't that used in a speech by like George W. Bush like recently too? That city on a hill like image too?
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised because it's part of. It's not a unknown speech, right? Like it's a pretty common. If you're into American history anyway, it was a rather famous, dictum, at the early days or whatever. As we get into the history, which I think is what we're going to do. I think I'm just going to start getting into the history of this because like you can't just go to the American Revolution. You gotta have to like go.
Gonna start monologuing.
Origins of it.
Yeah.
But no, I'm still gonna be looking at this from like a larger perspective, at least initially. Then we'll get into some like.
Well, and
details,
I do like that you're kind of setting up some interesting tropes too, right? I mean, you've already kind of gone through some of the like basic kind of hero's journey like structure when it comes to the founding. We're gonna get into some of the heavy hitters or the important people and how they sort of represent, kind of like Athena represents wisdom for Athens, the city of wisdom in ancient Greece. You have these figures who kind of represent different things, and maybe they did then. Obviously, they were real people then, but then they definitely do represent different ideals for us now. And so they are sort of set up as tropes, right? Just like we always talk about with like, there's the trickster trope, or there's the, I guess, now I'm kind of stuck on that one, but like,
well, yeah, no, there's tropes. There's like, so obviously you said the trickster, but there's also, I see now I'm kind of
the
stuck
fool.
on
Yeah,
it.
no, there's like the holy fool. There's
the
the crone. There's the warrior.
Yeah,
sorry, I was just blanking for a second. But anyway, you have, but then you have similar tropes to things that are maybe more emblematic to the 1700s or to the New World or to the age that they were in at the time too.
Well, and kind of, because they really are. Again, you can make this stuff up, but like it's crazy to me. You can probably hear the enthusiasm, the sheer geeking out in my voice, that this is all just like unadulterated history. It's not everything comes from a perspective, I suppose, but like the meat's all there, right? You just have to like cook with it. So like you talk about the people who are constituting this generation of like, founding fathers and whatnot. Like they all come out of this migration into the Americas and in the 1600s. And this frontier lifestyle, as they start to like bring European civilization and recreate it but kind of redefine it as they go. And all just the sheer social freedom at play out in the wilderness, right? Because it's all taking place is about a wilderness as you can get. I'm not taking anything away from like the native peoples that like lived here and had their own communities or whatever, but they weren't operating the way that like the Italian city-states were operating, right? Or the French monarchy was operating, or the British Empire was operating, right? It's just a categorically different kind of civilization that's occurring. And so, relatively speaking, it's the Americans, the Europeans that are coming over, mostly the British in this case, are recontextualizing the culture that they brought with them, which is parliamentarian, right? Like this is all, the monarchy in Britain has been heavily contextualized within a larger kind of parliamentarian government by this point, right? And so they're bringing that kind of idea with them. We're also like deeply in the thrall of the Enlightenment at this point, right? So political reconceptualization is everywhere, and they bring all that with them, right? But they have an opportunity kind of like unencumbered by the context of like the civilization that they were coming from to really just like play in this open sandbox that is like the Americas and just kind of like recreate things. And so you get people that are almost archetypal, that just kind of arise out of that process, you know. It's take Ben Franklin, for example, right? He's like this eccentric frontiersman. Well, he's like this weird eccentric scientist guy, you know, like he's like the Rick Moranis.
Oh, nice.
It's like if Rick Moranis from, you know, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and whatever, Davy Crockett, like melded together, you get like Ben Franklin, you know. He's this kind of crazy polymath that like, but he's also just like super eccentric, right? Like, just this, but he captivates people because he is just this ultimate like self-defined individual who is also highly cultured, right?
Well, yeah, he's always referred to as the Renaissance man.
Okay, he just had his hands in everything as far as all the learning of the day goes.
That's one way
but
to put
also,
it, yeah. Amongst other things, is that what you're gonna?
Yeah, well, he's a bit of a libertine, that's for sure. He was definitely unmoored from his, you know,
not the paragon of virtue as
he's
George
not
Washington
the paragon of virtue.
went on to represent. Is that what you're gonna say?
He's no George Washington.
Yeah, as another example.
You know, I imagine those people probably were kind of like awkward in the same room together, except for the fact that, you know, from what I understand, George Washington was so revered in his time that I think that he kind of walked around like a god amongst men. And even you know, the notorious Ben Franklin probably humbled himself a little bit before Washington. You just can't get over how much people like legitimately loved and venerated, you know, George Washington this time. But in a lot of ways, he totally earns it.
History had its eyes on him, you could say.
Yeah, it's true. Nice.
Oh,
Someone should put that in a song somewhere.
Just wait. Just you wait. Just you wait.
Yeah, you know, he for one, he was super tall, right? And as someone who's short by nature, I know that people admire tall people. So
as they
that
should.
ship is firmly
as they should.
Yes,
as they should.
Anyone who is just a tall guy is immediately you know, expected to be better than the rest of us. You know, whether they live up to that promise is often
it's a good
not
thing
the
they
case.
often do. Yeah.
No. But anyway, he was just like he epitomized regency. He epitomized, you know, he's out in this frontier, right? Like, but he's also a man of like deep honor and like deep humility. You know, he refused to be paid for his service as general. I mean, I think they like paid him anyway, but like he was like, no, I don't want money. Like I'll lead the forces, but I don't want money, kind of thing. I mean, ultimately, I think after the fact, like they ended up paying him, but you know, up until that, like that's just kind of the type of person he was. I mean, there's so many founding fathers to get through that like we could spend the rest of the episode talking about these, you know, individual characters. If you do watch that John Adams show, you'll like, if the show is any accuracy to the depiction of the person, which I have reason to believe it does, and I've read stuff about John Adams too. I've affectionately labeled him as like if John Hughes was writing a founding father figure.
Okay.
You get like John Adams because he's like a nerd. He's just like a nerd with like grandeur.
But he wins
like,
in the end. Yeah. Is that?
Oh no, he does. He gets the girl. Like he has. He is this person, and in real life, he was like a short, fat, relatively unattractive man, right? So he's just like the nerdy guy.
What are you trying to say about Paul Giamatti? Is that? I feel like that's who you're really roasting right now.
I love Paul Giamatti, and he was a perfect choice for him. He's exactly like he is just this person. He's a nerd that has a ton of potential and should be respected, but he doesn't have like the jock shoulders of George Washington. And so like he has to like kind of like work his way through like social amours, to rise to the top.
Does it remind you of somebody, Jacob? Is that what you're trying to say?
It's the second time I'm crying in this episode.
I feel like you've got the show art now. You've got my face on George Washington and your face on John Adams. Is that what you were going for?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what the show art looks like. But what can I say? I identify with John Adams. Anyway, wait, there's too many founding fathers to get through. Let me get into.
You're not going to mention Alexander Hamilton because you knew I was going to make another reference, weren't you? You're like, I'm just going to skip over that one.
You want to talk about Hamilton?
I feel like there's a million things he hasn't done. So how are you not going to bring it up?
Yeah, it's true. Well, his name is Alexander Hamilton, so we can just repeat that ad nauseum for the rest of the episode, and then probably get some Grammys for it or something. But I'm just kidding. I liked that soundtrack. It was good. So it's all right. We're gonna get back into the broader history.
I really liked actually what you did. Because we've talked about Cain and Abel in the past when we were talking about our scapegoat episode. When we had our scapegoat, we were talking about the founding of Rome and how you have the mimetic desire that's taking place within small communities, whether it's a family like the Cain and Abel story, and how that was kind of modeled. I wouldn't say modeled after because it came before, but it's parallel to the Romulus and Remus story in the founding of Rome. And you kind of do something similar when it comes to the North versus South kind of like, I don't know.
Well, because there's two, like from the beginning, right? Because there's basically like the Civil War is kind of like the sequel to the American Revolution. It really is. It's this fascinating, complex, like narrative arc where like part one is the American Revolution and part two is like so part one is kind of like the comedy of the in the classical Shakespearean sense, like it's a happy ending. And then like part two, the Civil War, is kind of like the death of Arthur kind of tragedy, situation, right? It's like the Godfather part two to the Godfather part one. It's just this fascinating like epic history, right? And I know there's tons of American history that takes place like after the Civil War, but the story kind of changes, right? Like whereas American Revolution and Civil War are kind of like two parts of the same story, and then after that, like there's like the resolution, and then you have like the rest of American history as its own like a unique, because the Civil War is kind of like a second founding. It's kind of like a reboot of America. Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways. And so there's a division there. Honestly, the Civil War is just that climactic. It kind of turns the page of history for America as such. But the seeds, as any good two-part story would do then, the seeds of everything that compels the story in the second part, they're laced throughout the first part, which is basically you have this kind of geographic division that starts almost immediately because of the basic nature of how migration from Europe came to America. When you have the early migration into America down south in Virginia, that's the Virginia Company. Mm-hmm. That's all about the tobacco trade. That's people. That's mercantilism. That's the British Empire looking to capitalize upon the commercial interest that they can get out of the American continent, right? Whereas the story that's driving the northern colonies is that pilgrim story that we celebrate at Thanksgiving, where you have these really, really pious, religiously devout individuals trying to flee religious persecution and set up shop and be that light to the world kind of thing.
Abel
and
have
everything
I
is very
loved.
yeah, I mean, there's like any really truly epic narrative, there's lots of like complexity to that because in some sense the like the pilgrims came to America for love of Jesus, but from a classical Christian perspective, because they were like Calvinist pilgrims, like they're Puritans, like they're about as Protestant as you can get, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of like the seeds of utopianism are actually planted in that devout piety way back in the day. So whereas down south, you actually have way more classical Christianity flourishing down south. Maryland is named for Queen Mary. Virginia is named for the Virgin Queen. Now I know these things, Elizabeth. I know these things are post-Reformation and things like that, but you have like lots of the Spanish are already down there, right in Florida with their Catholicism and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Louisiana and France, all that stuff, like give or take, like Quebec up in Canada, that's heavily Catholic and Frenchified too. But within the actual American continent, the United States continent, it's all Protestant up north, and there's a lot more of the kind of like Catholic thing going on down south. And so and so it's complicated. Now, from a Protestant perspective, they're going to say, oh, of course the Catholics are the the opportunistic, economically driven, pragmatic people, and the pious, pilgrims, they just love Jesus, right? And yet it's up north where industry takes over sooner than later, right? Whereas down south stays really agrarian and very traditional, almost chivalric. It's kind of like the last gasp of medieval society down south.
Yeah, well, that's actually where you would still see duels. Is more of like
like this honor code, this honor culture. It's far more medieval down south.
Where you still have the what's it called, the debutante like ball, like the cotillion, like that sort of like.
Yes, all of that is still alive and well down south. It's a much more traditional culture down south. Whereas up north, you have heavy industrialization take over, and you have the cities grow up. And frankly, because of the nature of, like I said, the seeds of Protestantism having such a heavy hand up north, it's also where you start to just people just move away from Christianity sooner than later. Like you get a lot more deism. You get a lot more, Thomas Jefferson was a deist, and he was definitely a Virginian, right? So this is all complex, right? And it's all really, really broad strokes. I'm just pointing out there's lots of interesting ironies. But that being said, fundamentally, the North was this kind of like utopian project. And with it was abolitionism. And the idea, like all of the good things we think of that stem from Enlightenment thinking were definitely in full effect up north, right? Whereas down south, you have a much more traditional culture that's loath to change. It's rooted in commerce. It's rooted in agrarian commerce specifically, right? And that goes all the way back to the tobacco trade with Virginia. Whereas up north, they're not shackled to any form of economy, and their economy can go any way it wants, kind of thing. Which again, it all kind of goes back to the nature of the people who came and settled up north. And so all of these seeds are planted, and you have this kind of Cain and Abel type thing going on early on, where you have the kind of mammon-driven South, and you have the kind of like purity-driven North, right? Just like the zeal for Christ going on up north. And all this stuff, it plays out in the sequel story of the Civil War. So you have this massive archetype going on, this kind of Cain and Abel story playing out, or the Romulus and Remus even thing going on.
And I guess maybe the ironic thing too, because if we're gonna because the thing about this, even though it's been very heavy history so far, is we're sort of trying to kind of find the mythological elements or the mythological seeds, and some of those mythological are also going to be theological, right? So the ironic sort of thing is, you have this Cain and Abel archetype that's kind of being set up. But in your scenario, the North obviously wins. Now it wins in terms of like preserving the Union, but is that sort of like an Abel beating Cain or killing Cain sort of thing? I mean, is that
the analogy only goes so far as the basic idea that you kind of have brothers, and one is coming from a place of like piety, and one's coming from a place of commerce, kind of thing. Obviously, both North and South were culturally Christian, right? Kind of at all stages. And frankly, the South kind of retains it a little bit better, ironically, just because the North is so much more quantity of ideas, education, colleges where thoughts and, both Ben Franklin in Philadelphia and Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, right, are two examples of like free thinkers of their day, revolutionaries, if you will, And there's a reason why they're not coming out of Georgia, frankly, that being said, Virginia is a weird, interesting state because it kind of has like all sides in it, but it's also because it's such a massive geographic area that it's just big enough to hold a lot of different culture in it. Ultimately, this original sin of slavery that is part of the American story, almost from the beginning.
Well, and sorry, but that expression
is kind of what kills.
Original sin of America is slavery. Like that. You're not the first person to use that expression. And so what I think is interesting about that, though, is there again, you've done, or not you, but like what we've done is we've sort of mythologized or theologized by using that language of original sin. Like we sort of put that into our history, or put that into our story, or put that into our myth. Does that make sense?
It does. And here's the thing is like, it's not a stretch. It's not a stretch, There's an interesting analogy here, the join or die flag, right?
Yeah.
That's really prevalent. It's a snake, and the snake is cut up into lots of different pieces. And each of those pieces has the initials of the state, the colony. So it's 13 pieces of a snake. And, it's Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New York and all that. And it says join or die. In other words, reassemble the snake. The snake has been cut up, but the snake cannot strike back. The snake cannot fight back. Basically the idea behind that symbolism is, at the time was we're deadly if you step on us, but we're not deadly if you step on us if we're cut up. So if you unite the snake, then the snake becomes deadly when stepped upon. But from our perspective, and within the context of this podcast, isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting symbolism that the snake becomes a primary symbol for the American fight against the British?
Yeah.
Right?
Who are the good guys? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it doesn't. I'll go ahead and allow for the Americans to be the good guys. I am a patriot, but at the same time, I am deeply sympathetic towards the British Empire at this point. All they wanted was to get paid back for defending the Americans during the French Indian Wars. They spent a ton of money. They spent a ton of money protecting the American colonists, in the decades leading up to the American Revolution. And then when that war was finally over, they're like, okay, well, we emptied our coffers on you guys. So we're going to raise your taxes so that we can get paid back for fighting this war on your behalf for 30 years.
How dare
they? And then
they?
the Americans got super upset about that. They're like, no way.
The
nerve. And in general, I'm sympathetic towards monarchies and things like that. I don't think they're bad or whatever. So there is this element of there certainly is mythologizing going on with the American description of the British monarchy. Even at the time, it was not altogether unreasonable. Which is funny because they call them the unreasonable acts, but in some ways it was, right? Because the British Empire, the monarchy, and he went about it wrong. They were kind of heavy-handed about it and expected loyalty and nothing else. Whereas the Americans thought of themselves as just being like they were children protected by their parents, and so children aren't expected to pay their parents back for protecting them, right? So like there is merit to the American interpretation of this, and the way that the British Empire like tried to force the taxes down was just bad politicking. They didn't understand, because they had left the Americans in the wilderness for a century by this point, and they had pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, so to speak, with a little help from some Native Americans teaching them how to make corn, right?
Yeah.
But like, and they had thrived. They had thrived, and they didn't need the heavy-handed governance. They didn't feel that they needed it anyway. So when the empire tries to enforce heavy-handed governance, it just doesn't go well. But as you go through like the history, the story of the revolution, it sounds like a myth. Like it sounds like a Homeric
But
odyssey.
doesn't that, because that kind of
just to say it
brings
out
us
loud.
back to our hero's journey thing, right? Because it's like that's the whole kind of oh gosh, now I'm blanking on it. It's the atonement with the Father. It's the atonement. You know what I mean? Where it's like,
Sure.
if America puts himself or herself, however you want to personify it, but if we turn ourselves into the hero going on this journey, we have to have that atonement with the Father before we can have the boon, and make the sort of return, so to speak, which in one sense is maybe still kind of happening if we're still kind of on the journey, but
Well, and it especially like later on, like eventually when you get to like, if you keep the story going and you get to like World War II, then like you actually do like if you extend the story beyond just the immediate context of the American Revolution, there is more hero's journey to be had here. Like there's more of those archetypes coming into play.
And I should probably
like America's
back up too,
a
when I say
special
the
story,
atonement with the Father, that's one of the steps on the hero's journey, and it's been a long time since we've actually gone through those steps, but it's where this reckoning kind of has to occur. And in this scenario, you kind of see, like you were saying, America had kind of grown up as this child of set of colonies, and they have to make it on their own. They go through all this difficulty, and it's almost like they have to then have this reckoning with their fatherland or with England, and that's what we would call that, American Revolution and stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
So
they have to prove to dad that they can stand on their own. And here's the thing, like, I kind of struggled where to bring this up in the conversation, but this is as good a place as any, is like the American Revolution is not a discontinuation. It's not the same kind of revolution as you tend to see in a lot of political revolutions. To dig into apophaticism a little bit as a theological concept.
About time.
Sometimes the best way to understand what something is to see what it is not, right? And so we have a perfect example in the French Revolution taking place just a decade later. And if you look at what the American Revolution looks like, and you look at what the French Revolution looks like, these two things are not the same, just at all, right? Like the French Revolution is a cataclysmic break in continuity with the culture of its past, or at least the attempt to do so, right? And a reasonably successful attempt to do so. Whereas the American Revolution was much more in trying to preserve what it felt was the British common good, like what was appropriate for the English common law tradition. And they operated within the context of the British common law tradition. And they were acting as British subjects, even up until the point of rejecting the monarch and going out on their own. It is in continuity with like all the revolutions that have been taking place within British history prior to that. Like the Glorious Revolution in the 1600s, and all the way going back down to like habeas corpus and things like that, and the Magna Carta. It's all this one constant continuity. America is a child of Britain, whereas the France that comes out of the French Revolution is a rejection of what came
I thought you were going to
before.
say an illegitimate child, or
Yeah, maybe.
I can't use
certainly
I can't
a vengeful,
use the word, or I'll
certainly
get in
a
trouble
vengeful
again.
child.
So, yeah. I can't. I don't have any more strikes with.
Yeah. I know. I always thought I'd be the one that got us canceled, but you're the one that's always so
Yeah.
like taking us right up to that line there.
I guess so.
But so yeah, you just have this unique situation with the American Revolution where it's like it's an unrevolutionary revolution. It's a natural growth out of, for better or for worse, right? But it is there is a common history. And it basically, even though you end up with a division between the British people and the American people, once the dust settles, there's common ground, there's common commerce, there's common heritage that's still just obvious and present, and natural allies and things like that. It's this really unique story within history, frankly, at least modern history, anyway. There was just something unique about the people of the Americas because they came about in this Enlightenment time, and it was post-printing press, and they were out there kind of working on their own. Where it legitimately created this like whole citizenry of like kind of stoic, kind of like stoic philosophers, where like they were all just like farmers, but they were also like super literate. Like, and they would just like read all of their newspapers and their like political tracts, and were just like heavily engaged with their society because they had like ownership of it. Whereas like, back in Europe, it was like this kind of caste system, and everyone was kind of like in their kind of like, grand order of being, if you will. And so much of the American story is this kind of like
flattening out.
We can flatten this out.
It's funny,
again, for better or for worse, but that's just kind of what the story is.
Not even on purpose, not to relate this back to the scapegoating episode that we did, but we talk about that flattening out and how that's, you said for better or worse, because there's obviously been a lot of good for it when it comes to like social mobility or economic mobility and all that stuff. Or even just the idea that, like you said, you have these people who are farmers who are like incredibly literate and invested in their society. And it's like, who would ever say that's a bad thing? And yet it also can be, the seeds of, again, to go back to the scapegoat episode, a lot of mimetic desire that had never been there in all of human history, right? Because you were not even in the same circle. You were, and so you didn't see that as something to desire in the first place. And now, we've got that on an exponential level. But
if you go through just like how the founding fathers talk about what they're trying to achieve and what they believe about their fellow citizens and whatnot, it's incumbent upon the virtue that they see that comes out of that hard scrabble life. It comes out of that frontier existence and that like ownership of society and the high level of investment that each individual in America like has for like what their political enterprise is. The founding fathers, they look around, they see that, and they say, with that type of like gumption, we can pull this thing off. There's this famous quote attributed to Benjamin Franklin when he comes out of the Constitutional Convention after the Revolutionary War, where someone says, Mr. Franklin, what is the results? And he's like, a republic, if you can keep it, right? He's saying we're delivering you guys this idea that we can be self-governed in this Republican fashion, if you can keep it. Now the grand experiment starts, because Ben Franklin, he's ever the experimenter, he's ever the social scientist, and he's like, let's see what you can do. Let's see what this. But he believed.
And so the American experiment begins.
And so it begins. And so
it's been a while since I've had a Hamilton quote, so I had to get one in there.
Yeah, well, you just keep peppering them in here. Maybe we'll get more clicks. Like, oh, Hamilton. That's what I'm gonna do. We're just gonna have the Hamilton cover.
Friend of the show, Lin-Manuel Miranda. That would really be good for us too, wouldn't it?
So, we've talked a long time just about the basic wealth of conversation points that flow out.
Every superhero needs a good origin story, so.
It's true. Let me just go through, now that we've laid out all these kind of
Oh, in the last 10 minutes,
45
please.
minutes is 45. Yeah.
Please.
It's all right. I'm just gonna zoom through it because it's just the story unto itself is incredible. So here's how the American Revolution goes, right? You start out with like all these taxes being raised and the Americans being upset about it. And so what happens? But you get some. It all starts in Boston. Boston is just a bunch of uppity folk who are super cocksure of themselves. And Sam Adams goes and he gets his Sons of Liberty. It's like this, like, men's club. Yeah, I know. And they're like, I know what I'm gonna do. We're gonna show them. We're gonna go dress up like natives, like outsiders. We're gonna go adopt the persona of people outside the system. And we're going to go commandeer a ship and dump all of the tea out of it that they're trying to tax us on, just to like spit in their eye and say, we don't need your stinking tea, right? And so that's what they do. And I can't help but sit there and think about this idea that like you literally have people who are adopting an outsider's garb in order to go inflict a statement, a message to be sent back to the king kind of thing.
I wasn't aware that was something a person could do.
And it's like a frat party. There's something juvenile about it. There's something like Peter Pan and his lost boys taking on Captain Hook kind of thing, where like you have people just like dressing up like the natives, like the outsiders, to go and just play dress up, and take on the symbolism of that persona, which they're intentionally doing. But that's how this all starts. It starts with like a prank. It starts with like a goofy, symbolic prank.
And it's kind of a shedding of the old self too. I mean, it's very much like when a person, before they were baptized, they would unrobe, they would disrobe and put on a new, obviously to use the biblical language, they would put on Christ, but they're shedding themselves of their patrimony, of who they were, because they were wearing clothes that would have been more associated with England or with Europe. And like you said, they put on these clothes that were associated now with this new land, with this native land. And so you have this kind of shedding of the old self and taking on a new self too, which, I'm not trying to make an explicit like connection to baptism, but it's there.
Well, and the fact that it takes place in the water is also kind of interesting,
that
right?
There's some submerging going on.
This grand moment is not happening in a landlocked situation. It's on a ship,
reject Satan and all his works and all his empty promises too, right? And that was a rejection.
Yeah, right. Plus, the Sons of Liberty is just a cool name for a group. I applaud you, Sam Adams. All right, and so what happens next? Like tensions are super high, and you get the Boston Massacre, right? Which is basically the killing of the innocents within America's like story here, because it absolutely enrages the native population. Whereas before there was like still a lot of like simmer. What really blows this up is the idea that innocent people, supposedly, right, are killed in this massacre.
You have to have a tribute. You have to have a tribute, right? A sacrifice.
Well, it is. It reminds me of like in the Moses story, like the innocents in Egypt,
or the
like
Bethlehem,
the firstborn being killed and things like that, or the Bethlehem thing. It's this archetypal experience within like a mythology that takes place, right? And so the fun side note being like what makes John Adams cool is he actually goes and like stands up and defends the British soldiers. If you watch that John Adams show, like there's an entire episode dedicated just to like that trial, basically. And it's just an awesome moment in American history, because this person who's going to become the president of the United States one day basically starts his career and like makes his name, his kind of first step up the rung ladder of success is by successfully defending the people who are the bad guys in this mythic trope of killing the innocents.
Yeah.
There's just something fascinating about that.
Well, it's very much the whole defending the because
that's the spirit. That's the spirit of and that's the British Commonwealth spirit too, right? That's why this is in such continuity. This is not, if it was the French Revolution, it'd just be off with their heads, right? And that's just not what happens. It's like, no, like, hey, are we not Are we not, just?
It was always supposed to be
are we as
that
bad as
we're
they,
better than
you
this.
know?
Yeah. It's
Right,
it's
yeah.
kind of that
And so-
stoicism
and he
thing
does.
where you're above the seeking of revenge, you're above the, the out for bloodlust. Like that's what I mean, because you mentioned
Yep.
that stoicism before, and it's like we have that baked right into our version of Christianity, at least in the North with the Puritans. The Puritans were
Yep.
that's about as close as you can get to Christian stoicism in one particular sect. I mean, obviously there are Christian Stoics in all versions of, Christianity, but like if you had to pick one that was just that. And so
Mhm. No, it's just a great moment. After that you get Paul Revere's ride because, Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world, because Boston gets clamped down, after the Boston Massacre stuff. And it's like, okay, now things are really starting to hit the fan. And the British Empire starts to take like more kind of like dramatic postures towards like commandeering people's like weapons and things like that to kind of prevent
they're taking our guns away.
all of it. Yeah, exactly. They're taking our guns away, and so the Americans are like, no, and it erupts into a battle at Lexington Concord, and then you have this super, archetypal story of like a messenger being sent out in the middle of the night, crying from the
herald.
streets. Paul Revere's
A
ride,
herald
it's
of the gospel.
yeah. It's crazy. This is just, these are just stories that like are just like the basic facts of this narrative.
And everybody,
Meanwhile,
it's kind of like how people will always like debunk, like, or everybody will always seek out during Christmas and Easter time of like, oh, this isn't actually the case. Everybody always does this with Paul Revere's ride where it's like, well, it wasn't actually like, and it's like, no, you're missing the point then. You're missing the point if you have to disprove that Paul
Yeah.
Revere went on the ride and said the British are coming. It's like, the one by land, two by sea. Like you're missing the mythological element to it.
sure. One of the things, this is like less well known, but it's all still part of the lead up. And I'm going to bring it up because it plays into some of these mythic tropes a little bit, is while the British are sitting here trying to like consolidate their power over the colonies around the time that Paul Revere is going on his ride, you have Fort Ticonderoga over in New York being taken over by Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys.
Okay.
So Ethan Allen was this like frontiersman, kind of like proto Davy Crockett, and he's like Robin Hood with his like band of merry men. It's just like this like these frontier folk, and they sit there and they take over a fort, this British fort on Lake Champlain, and it's just funny that there's a guy called Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, and they like take over. It's just like, yeah, that's a thing,
It's just a good story. Like that's just.
I want them to do it. I hope they did it with bows and arrows, though I don't think they did. But it would be, it'd be cool if they did, and they wore like green leggings while they did it.
Oh boy.
So one of the people that helped take over that fort though was a little known fella by the name of Benedict Arnold. You might have heard of that guy once or twice
Judas
in history.
character in the story. It has to be.
Every good myth needs a Judas character,
Mhm.
and of course we got one. So yeah, he is a heroic individual for most of the story, and one of George Washington's like kind of trusted lieutenants and whatnot, and this is one of his early escapades is taking over Fort Ticonderoga. And they take the cannons from that fort and they bring it back to Boston, and that's how they repel the British, because Boston gets hunkered down. The colonists fight back. There's the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is kind of like the really official opening fight of the war.
Mhm.
Give or take Lexington or Concord, but the cannons that are taken from Ticonderoga help that battle work in favor of the Americans at Bunker Hill, right? Now, technically, the British win that battle, but it's like a Pyrrhic victory, So you have this thing where it's like, oh wow, these upstart Americans are going to be tougher to beat than we thought. After that, the revolution starts in earnest. You get the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, and we hardly need to cover that. It's such an iconic thing.
Well, part of me actually wants to, because we're at about 59 or almost 60 minutes. I said before we even started that we should just revisit this, maybe on like either Memorial Day, or you said wait until next July 4th. I don't know if we're going to want to wait that long, but, or if you're going to want to wait that long, you should say. I think we actually did a lot of really good, like, not necessarily build up, like this has to be like a part 1 and a part 2, but I think we did a lot of just like,
to be honest,
a lot of
it's
you could say mythological foundations though, or tropological foundations to the origin story, America's hero's journey origin story. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does actually make sense. And frankly, if we actually end with the Declaration of Independence, it's probably a really, really clean break point.
Isn't it though?
It is, yeah. And it's kind of fitting. It's ironic to end our 4th of July episode with
The 4th of July?
it's actually probably
No,
fitting.
you know what?
Like, yeah, it's like we
You got to figure
let
out.
ourselves up to the 4th
I was
of
going to say, you
July
got to figure out how to do some fireworks sound effects, and that's just it right there. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose, Mike. I guess I'll get off my podium here
This hasn't been enough.
and
This hasn't been enough
put
for
down
you?
my fervor.
No, I'll be honest. Like, even just in talk, because you're more of the history guy. Like, I have the theology and the philosophy background just in my studies and stuff. But your bachelor's is in history, and so this has always been kind of more of your wheelhouse, if anything. And so,
Yep.
even just getting to talk more with you about it, and I was like, oh, that sounds like a book that I'd want to read or watch the John Adams show or something like that. So I think just being able to, because it's probably not, it's not as easy for me to recognize these mythological elements to history stories, right? Because we get so
Sure.
ingrained with seeing history as history, mythology as mythology, and never the two shall meet. And so being able to kind of have this conversation with you has been like, I've really enjoyed getting to kind of bring those together in a powerful way too. So no, I look forward to continuing the conversation with you about it. And yeah, I don't know, just hearing more of what, whether it comes to the history of the United States and how the kind of mythology matches up with it or other stuff too. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't mean to cut you off. Was there anything to
wetted? No, this is a great place to stop. I hope you guys' appetites have been whet for the further adventures of the American colonists and their revolutionary ways. We'll find a good time to continue the story. But yeah, no, it's one of my favorite subjects. It's just one of my favorite historical subjects. It's just endlessly fascinating to me. So, yeah, and then maybe next time we'll talk some more pop culture too.
Yeah.
Like, get into some other like movie references or something like that.
Well, yeah, no,
But
we didn't
like,
even talk about, we both were talking about The Patriot, the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, which has a lot of that mythological element to it as well. Like because, people will sit and just complain about the lack of history or the revised history that might be in that movie when it's like, you're kind of missing the point when you're missing the mythology that's in there too.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, it's definitely kind of a pulpy take on, the revolutionary period, but it's fun. Alrighty, man. Yeah, no, this is a good time. But, yeah, I appreciate you letting me wax on about it. And,
well,
I love this holiday. I love the 4th of July. It's one of the few times in the year that I get to sit there and kind of like ignore
you said all the kids
some of the things I
around-
dislike.
The kids sit around you at the fire, and kids, let me tell you a story about America.
Let me tell you about a man and his cherry tree.
Well, Jacob, I hope that
but,
you can forgive me for cutting you off. I mean, forgiveness. Can you
No.
imagine?
I'm gonna revolt. I demand a revolution.
Oh no,
These
that was just my hackneyed way of getting another Hamilton reference in. Thanks for coming to
I
listen,
get
and
it.
yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a positive comment, 5-star rating on the show, and yeah, we look forward to probably going in a different direction as we get through the rest of July. But then we can revisit this maybe Memorial Day or whenever the case is. But,
Be proud to be an American, or at least you're free.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.